For decades, Joyce Meyer stood as a symbol of strength, survival, and certainty. Millions saw her as the woman who turned unimaginable pain into faith and faith into a global empire. But behind the familiar voice and steady smile, cracks have been forming, quietly, relentlessly. Now at a moment when her legacy should be secure, the ground beneath her is shifting in ways even her most loyal followers never expected. The foundation built on pain. Joyce Meyer's story did not begin with success, confidence, or influence. It began in silence. Born in St. Louis during World War II, she entered a home already shaped by absence and fear. Her father returned from the war changed, angry, controlling, and increasingly violent. What followed was not a single traumatic event, but a sustained pattern of abuse that lasted nearly her entire childhood. By her own account, the abuse began when she was still a small child and continued weekly until she left home at 18, totaling more than 200 assaults. This was not chaos. It was routine, enforced by fear and secrecy. The deeper wound was not only what her father did, but what her mother did not do. Her mother knew. She saw the signs. Yet, she remained silent, paralyzed by fear, shame, and dependence. For Joyce, that silence became a second betrayal. It taught her that suffering could exist openly inside a home while the outside world remained unaware. This lesson would later shape how she understood faith, authority, and survival. At 9 years old, Joyce turned to Christianity, not as comfort, but as an idea, something distant and abstract. Faith did not stop the abuse. It did not protect her. It existed alongside her suffering, unresolved and confusing. She learned early that belief alone did not guarantee safety. This tension between faith and reality would follow her for decades. When she finally escaped at 18, she did not step into healing. She stepped into vulnerability. With no emotional framework for trust or stability, she entered her first marriage quickly, hoping love would erase the past. Instead, it recreated it. Her husband was manipulative, dishonest, and eventually criminal. He abandoned her repeatedly, left her stranded without money, and ultimately involved her in financial crimes that would haunt her conscience for years. When he was later imprisoned for fraud, Joyce was left with guilt, shame, and the realization that survival had taught her how to endure pain, but not how to choose safety. The marriage that saved her, and the cost of survival. By the late 1960s, Joyce Meyer was free from her first marriage, but not free from its damage. The divorce ended the relationship, yet the habits formed by years of abuse remained deeply embedded. She coped the only way she knew how, through control, anger, and emotional armor. She smoked heavily, spent long nights in bars, and moved through short-lived relationships, not searching for rebellion, but for silence inside her own mind. Trauma does not disappear when circumstances change. It waits. In 1967, Joyce married Dave Meyer, an engineering draftsman and former Army veteran. This marriage did not begin with romance or emotional ease. It began with imbalance. Joyce entered the relationship wounded, volatile, and guarded. She later admitted she was controlling, verbally aggressive, and emotionally exhausting. Dave entered it steady, disciplined, and calm. Where Joyce reacted, Dave absorbed. Where Joyce exploded, Dave remained quiet. For years, the marriage was strained not by infidelity or abandonment, but by emotional pressure. Joyce punished with silence, withdrew affection, and projected unresolved rage onto the one person who stayed. Dave endured it longer than most would have, but endurance has limits. At one breaking point, he told her something that would change the direction of her life. He had tried everything to make her happy, and since she was determined to be unhappy, he would choose joy anyway. That moment mattered, not because it was dramatic, but because it removed her control. Joyce realized that her pain no longer gave her power over the people around her. For the first time, she was forced to look inward rather than outward. Dave later admitted he did not know how much longer he could live under that weight. The fear of losing the only stable relationship she had ever known finally pierced through her defenses. In February 1976, something shifted. Joyce was driving home frustrated, praying the same prayers she had prayed for years, asking why the Bible promised victory she did not feel. Then, according to her account, she sensed God speak directly to her heart, telling her that patience was being taught to her. What followed was an experience she later described as liquid love, a moment that felt overwhelming, physical, and transformative. From a basement closet to a national voice, what began as informal Bible studies soon outgrew living rooms and lunch breaks. By the early 1980s, Joyce Meyer's teaching had moved into church spaces and then into microphones. The transition was not strategic at first. It was practical. People wanted more access to what she was saying, and the only way to reach them consistently was through radio. In 1985, Joyce launched Life in the Word, her first independent radio program. The production was modest to the point of fragility. Recordings were done inside her home, sometimes in a bedroom closet to reduce noise. The show aired for 15 minutes a week on a single station in St. Louis. There were no guarantees, no national sponsors, and no polished image. But the response was immediate. Letters began arriving from listeners who felt understood in ways church sermons had never reached them. Joyce spoke plainly about emotional wounds, fear, anger, and the mental exhaustion that followed trauma. She did not frame faith as escape. She framed it as endurance. Within a few years, the program expanded to multiple stations across the Midwest. This growth mattered because it coincided with a shift in Joyce's role inside the church. At Life Christian Center in Fenton, Missouri, what started as a struggling congregation of roughly 30 people changed rapidly once her teaching took root. Her women's Bible study exploded in size, drawing hundreds weekly. The church leadership noticed. In 1980, Joyce was ordained as an associate pastor, a rare position for a woman at the time. Woman at the time. The ordination gave her authority. The radio gave her reach. Together, they created momentum that could not be contained inside one church or city. In 1993, encouraged by Dave Meyer, Joyce made the leap to television. It was a risk. Television demanded money, infrastructure, and constant output. But it also offered something radio could not: presence inside the home. Her program first aired on regional and national networks, including WGN and BET. The choice was deliberate. These platforms offered access to audiences beyond traditional evangelical spaces. Viewers saw something unfamiliar: a preacher who did not hide her past. Joyce spoke openly about childhood sexual abuse, emotional damage, and the long-term effects of trauma. That honesty drew viewers who had never felt addressed by religious programming. By the late 1990s, the show was renamed Enjoying Everyday Life, a title that reflected her core message, that faith was not only about doctrine, but about surviving ordinary pain. Syndication expanded rapidly. The program moved into dozens of countries and languages, eventually becoming one of the most widely distributed religious broadcasts in the world. When success invites scrutiny. By the early 2000s, Joyce Meyer Ministries was no longer a growing platform. It was an empire. Annual revenue had climbed past $100 million, placing the organization among the most financially powerful ministries in the country. With that growth came infrastructure, large offices, production studios, full-time staff, and global outreach programs. On the surface, everything pointed to success, but underneath, questions were beginning to surface. Quietly at first, then loudly. The shift happened when financial records became public. Investigative reports revealed details that many donors had never imagined. Joyce Meyer's salary had once reached nearly $1 million per year. Her husband Dave earned close to half that amount. Ministry funds had been used to purchase multiple luxury homes, including properties for their children. The ministry headquarters itself was filled with high-end furnishings costing millions. Custom furniture, rare decor, and expensive artwork. One purchase in particular became symbolic of excess. A marble-topped antique commode costing over $20,000 paid for with ministry funds. These details spread quickly. For supporters, the revelations felt confusing. Joyce had built her message on humility, discipline, and emotional responsibility. For critics, the spending confirmed long-held suspicions about prosperity preaching. The idea that faith could unlock material blessing had always been controversial. Now, it appeared to be lived out in ways that many believers found impossible to reconcile. In 2007, the U.S. Senate Finance Committee launched an investigation into several high-profile televangelists. Joyce Meyer was among them. The inquiry focused on whether tax-exempt ministries were being used for personal enrichment. The investigation examined salaries, luxury expenses, private jets, and overseas accounts. For Joyce Meyer Ministries, the timing could not have been worse. Public trust was already shaken. While the investigation did not result in criminal charges or loss of tax-exempt status, it forced structural changes. The ministry reduced Joyce's official salary and restructured compensation through book royalties. Independent board members were added. Annual financial reports became public. Joyce Meyer Ministries joined an evangelical financial accountability organization, signaling an effort toward transparency. But damage had already been done. For many observers, the reforms felt reactive rather than proactive. Critics argued that accountability only came once pressure became unavoidable. Supporters felt conflicted, grateful for the ministry's impact yet uneasy about how power and money had reshaped it. At the same time, theological criticism intensified. Past teachings about prosperity, sickness, and faith were revisited. Statements suggesting that illness or tragedy could result from insufficient belief resurfaced and were widely condemned. Years later, Joyce would publicly admit that some of her teachings had been out of balance. But for many, that acknowledgement came after years of harm had already been done. The tragedies were ones no platform could silence. For all the criticism Joyce Meyer Ministries faced over money and theology, nothing shook its foundation like the tragedies that followed. These were events so disturbing that no explanation, apology, or reform could fully contain them. They were not abstract controversies. They involved lives lost, warnings missed, and questions that still lingered. The most devastating case emerged from within the ministry itself. Christopher Coleman, the head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, was trusted with protecting the organization and its leaders. Outwardly, he appeared stable, disciplined, and dependable. Privately, he was unraveling. Coleman was having an affair and had begun constructing an elaborate web of lies, including sending himself anonymous death threats. He told people his family was in danger because of his work with the ministry. In reality, the danger came from him. In a calculated act of violence, Coleman murdered his wife and their 2 young sons inside their home. The crime shocked the country. Investigators quickly uncovered evidence of his deception, including emails, phone records, and the fabricated threats. He was later sentenced to life in prison without parole. The tragedy did not end there. The victim's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Joyce Meyer Ministries, alleging that warning signs had been ignored and that the organization failed to act on information that could have prevented the murders. The ministry denied responsibility, stating that even law enforcement had not predicted the crime. Ultimately, the case was dismissed by a judge who ruled there was no legal basis to hold the ministry accountable. At the same time, Joyce was carrying another grief, one far more personal and quietly devastating. Her younger brother, David, died alone in Los Angeles. His body was found in an abandoned building, badly decomposed and identified only through dental records. He had been dead for nearly a month. When Joyce received his ashes, the personal effects were painfully small: an empty wallet, a broken watch, and a pocket knife. David's life had followed a different path. He struggled with addiction, instability, unpaid child support, and repeated attempts at rehabilitation that never lasted. Joyce tried to help him, offering work, support, and treatment, but he repeatedly walked away. When she spoke publicly about his death, she framed it not as judgment, but as sorrow mixed with helplessness. They came from the same family. They suffered differently, and they chose differently. For nearly 2 decades, Joyce Meyer's voice had a permanent home. Her daily program aired consistently on the same Christian television network, reaching millions who had built their routines around it. The relationship felt stable, almost unbreakable. And then suddenly, it wasn't. In early 2025, Joyce Meyer Ministries quietly pulled Enjoying Everyday Life from the network. There was no dramatic announcement, no press conference, just silence, followed by questions. Viewers noticed first, then insiders began to speak. The official explanation was vague, but the underlying reason was far more serious. Allegations had surfaced against the network's leadership involving the handling of sexual abuse claims within the founding family. Internal disputes, leaked documents, and public accusations painted a disturbing picture of denial, control, and silence. For Joyce Meyer, this was not just another controversy. It struck directly at the core of her personal history. She had built her life and ministry on the testimony of surviving childhood sexual abuse and on the belief that silence enables harm. Staying connected to a platform accused of protecting abusers was not something she could reconcile publicly or privately. Joyce Meyer Ministries scrambled to stabilize. The program was redistributed across new platforms, other religious networks, digital streaming, and online video channels. While the digital audience began to grow, it did not fully replace what was lost. Older viewers did not always follow. Younger viewers were harder to retain. The sense of permanence that once defined the ministry was gone. At the same time, Joyce herself was aging. The woman who had carried this organization for decades was now in her 80s. Leadership responsibilities increasingly shifted to family members. Questions about succession, transparency, and long-term direction became unavoidable. Critics revisited old concerns about nepotism and governance. Supporters wondered how much longer the ministry could remain unified under the weight of constant scrutiny. So where does Joyce Meyer go from here? Redemption, reinvention, or quiet retreat? Do you believe her legacy will endure, or has the damage finally become too much to overcome? Share your thoughts below, and if you want more in-depth stories like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe.